Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Rachel Yacono. On this week's episode, we feature a special conversation in honor of Memorial Day. This week, regular Theresa Cardinal Brown is joined by special guests Steve Miska and Dave Lapan. Steve, a retired Army colonel, and Dave, a retired Marine colonel, spend the episode discussing the work Iraqi and Afghan interpreters did for the U.S. military, the dangers they faced, and the efforts to get them visas to come to the United States. More of that to come, so stick around. Earlier this year, President Biden announced he will withdraw all American troops from Afghanistan over the course of the coming months, completing the military exit by the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks that drew the United States into its longest war. The announcement subsequently sparked a dialogue about the Special Immigrant Visa Program, which Congress created in 2006 to provide visas to Afghan and Iraqi translators to come to the United States after their service assisting U.S. military operations abroad. Unfortunately, the program is extremely backlogged and limited. It takes an average of nearly 3 years for applications to be processed, in part because of the rigorous vetting involved, according to the State Department. Right now, there are about 18,000 Afghans waiting for approval and fewer than 11,000 slots. Many Afghans who were translators for the U.S. military fear that once the United States pulls out of Afghanistan, the Taliban will execute them for aiding the United States. Consequently, veterans, military members, and members of Congress have called for the SIV program to be expanded and expedited so the United States doesn't leave Afghans who were instrumental in helping the U.S. military behind. Today's special guests, former military officers who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, have been advocates for this program and the interpreters who were so important to their service. Theresa, I'll leave it to you to introduce Steve and Dave.
Thanks, Rachel. I'd like to welcome to the program Steve Miska and welcome back to the program David Lapan. Steve is a retired Army colonel and currently serves as executive director of First Amendment Voice and is the founder of Servant Leader Citizen Consulting. He retired in 2015 after 25 years of service in the military. He's taught at both the undergraduate level at West Point and the graduate level at Marine Corps University. Previously, he served as the White House Director for Iraq on the National Security Council. He is the author of the recently released book, Baghdad Underground Railroad, Saving American Allies in Iraq, a memoir of the work he and his team did to help dozens of foreign military interpreters escape Baghdad to Amman, Jordan, and then to the United States. Dave Lapan is a familiar voice to This Week listeners from his time as BPC's former Vice President of Communications. He has now since moved on to other things, but he is also, well known to us, a retired Marine colonel with more than 30 years of military service and 22 years of communications and public affairs experience at the highest levels of the Defense Department. As a public affairs officer, he served as spokesman and advisor for the Defense Department, for the 18th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and for the commander of the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, and U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and for multinational forces during military operations in Haiti and Iraq. Dave was the press secretary and deputy assistant secretary for media operations at the Department of Homeland Security. Steve and Dave, welcome to This Week in Immigration. We are really excited for today's conversation.
Thanks, Theresa. Really glad to be here.
And for me, good to be back.
So, Steve, I'm going to kick things off with you. Not Americans probably know about the Special Immigrant Visa Program or really understand the vital role interpreters play in aiding U.S. military abroad. So from your perspective, can you talk about your own service and work with Iraqi interpreters and talk to us about your work in helping them escape to the United States?
Sure, yeah. And so I really became acutely aware of this in 2006 and 2007 in Baghdad. It was the height of sectarian cleansing, and literally anybody working alongside Americans was being targeted by all sides. But the interpreters were in a very prominent role. They were on patrol with us every day, going into meetings with us with sheikhs and police chiefs and other civic leaders. And so at the time, they literally had to wear face masks. They all had combat nicknames, because if you knew their real name, you could trace their tribe and potentially the town where they originated from in Iraq, and it put their families at risk. So they were our cultural eyes, ears, and mouthpieces, and enabled us to do what we were doing in a conflict zone. And when they started being targeted, I realized, if I don't do something, I won't be able to look myself in the mirror. And so I decided to try to figure it out. And that's when the special immigrant visa had just gotten passed. And a lot of leaders in the field, Ambassador Crocker leading the charge, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq at the time, was trying to get Congress to expand the number. Originally, it was just 50 visas between Iraq and Afghanistan, a minuscule number. And so they expanded it to 500 in 2007. And fortunately, my team was able to get about 36 out of Baghdad at that time. And we called it the Underground Railroad because there was a catch-22 built in the system. I know that's hard to imagine coming from government, as we all have, but Embassy Baghdad had closed its doors to Iraqis, citing security concerns. And that was the last step in the process, really, was an interview and getting chief of mission approval. So they were told they had to go to Amman, Jordan, but the Jordanians had closed the border due to a refugee crisis from Iraq. So our interpreters had to come up with alibis for why they needed to get to Jordan. And then if they were successful in doing that and passing their interview, we had sponsors in the United States prepared to receive them and help them get their feet on the ground. And to their credit, at least 6 of the dozens I helped get out enlisted in either the Army or the Marines when they got here, and then deployed back as combat linguists. I mean, they were that committed to the cause. And that's why it's so important that we take care of those who have shared those risks along with us.
Dave, speaking from your own military service, can you provide our listeners a little background about your experience in Afghanistan? I mean, you worked for the most senior officials there. What are your thoughts about the support that the Afghans people provided to the security forces there, and why is it important that we honor that now?
I'd say very similar, but different. Obviously, different countries, different pressures. The Taliban was generally the force that was operating in Afghanistan as opposed to the forces in Iraq. But the interpreters faced the same types of challenges of needing to remain anonymous, having threats against them and their families, not being able to return home or having to do so surreptitiously because there were, very real threats to their lives and to their families' lives. Afghanistan was known for something called night letters that went beyond, this particular instance of interpreters being under threat. But the Taliban would leave messages for Afghans if they felt that they were collaborating or for any other reason. And they sent very stern messages that were meant to keep people in line. So those Afghan interpreters and contractors who work for the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan face similar circumstances to those in Iraq. Threats against them, threats against their families, the need to remain anonymous to the extent that they could. And as Steve has described in his book, that not being able to go home and visit families for fear of tipping off the Taliban to the fact that they were working with the Americans and putting not only their families, but their tribes at risk, their villages.
So talk to me about some of these people. I mean, it sounds like they were willing to put themselves and their families at risk to help, the Americans and the international forces in Afghanistan. What's driving them? What kind of people are they that would do this, under that kind of a threat? Can you describe some of the folks that you encountered and what drove them to do this?
Sure. An interesting other cultural feature throughout of Afghanistan, but mostly in the south where the Pashtun tribe is mostly located, is this concept known as Pashtunwali, or hospitality toward visitors, to include, military troops. They saw that if you're in our country, you are here, we are going to take care of you. We will, serve you tea. We will welcome you into our homes. So they already had this sense of friendship, of hospitality, of helping. And a large number of them recognized that the U.S., unlike the Soviets, were not there to occupy their country, that we were there to free them from the Taliban and from Al-Qaeda and others. And so they saw the opportunity of working for U.S. and coalition forces, a large coalition mission in Afghanistan, as ways to help their country move forward. And that's one thing that I think, while there's been a lot of criticism about not only the U.S. presence, but again, the coalition presence in Afghanistan over the years, people sometimes ignore the benefits of that. So whether it's death and destruction, all the things that come with conflict and combat, the advances in technology, in freedoms, in education, especially for women and girls. So Afghan society really evolved during the time we were there. And I think those local Afghans saw that presence as being potentially positive for their country and were willing, as you said, put their lives, their families' lives at risk to be part of that.
Yeah. Steve, what about in Iraq? I mean, the mission there was a little bit different, but what do you think was some of the driving factors to the Iraqis that helped you?
Listening to Dave, there's a lot of striking parallels to me. That idea of hospitality is very prevalent amongst Iraqis, and then the excitement around the initial occupation, I guess, and the U.S. entrance in, knowing that we were about trying to foment some of those freedoms that had been repressed under Saddam, and seeing, a lot of liberation in certain areas. And then you can see the ebbs and flows of that over time based on whether we've got influence or, say, Iranian-sponsored militia have influence. And then there's more of a theocratic approach to those freedoms. And it plays out. You can see it in terms of how it plays out on women and girls in particular. That's, a real telling factor. It's a complex question, Theresa, because as for the reasons that any of us take a position, right, there are multiple factors driving us. And so while a paycheck is always a good thing, and we were known to pay well, there were, I think, other more altruistic motives that drove people, and that then tended to, depend on the conditions of the time as well. And the security was really of grave concern for many of them.
How many people are we talking about in between Iraq and Afghanistan that are either have applied for these visas or would apply? How many people total do you think were part of the group, part of the folks that helped out our troops?
Well, currently, what I'm seeing in the nonprofit sector, and this is corroborated by the State Department as well, is there's a backlog of at least 17,000 Afghans for special immigrant visas. They represent approximately 70,000 family members when you include family members in that population. And then on the Iraqi side, it is in excess of 100,000. It's really difficult to get good figures there, especially because the special immigrant visa for Iraq twilighted in 2014. So that's no longer available. And that's been a call by Iraqis as well as many veterans and other organizations trying to get Congress maybe to reenact the SIV or make it something that's a part and parcel of any conflict we enter into, because it gives us an important safety valve.
Dave, you're both military people. You've been probably studying military history. I mean, we have gone into lots of different places. And I think, some people of a certain age will remember how we left Vietnam and the years and decades following where South Vietnamese especially, who had worked alongside U.S. troops, were trying to get to the United States. I mean, how from the military perspective do you view what we owe to these people?
You're right. Is there some kind of, promissory note that we signed? No. Are there documents where we verified that these individuals did this service to the country? Yes. But there was certainly an expectation that we would help take care of the people who took care of us, that put their lives and their families' lives at risk. So it is more a matter of our values and upholding our values rather than some, ironclad written promise that we have made. And as Steve alluded to, in future conflicts, we will be judged according to how we operated in these conflicts. If we just leave behind the people that risk their lives for us and their families, how will we be trusted when we go elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, it's, Dave, you just made me think of just a really striking quote there as well. When we did withdraw from Iraq in 2007, the Iranians were on the ground, and Qasem Soleimani was quoted at the Times in the New York Times, and he said he was saying to the Iraqis, "We're not like the Americans. We don't leave our friends behind." Now that was sort of a double-edged quote there, letting them know he wasn't going to be very far away. But it's that resonates. Those types of narratives resonate in all areas of the world that I'm aware of. We go to conflict now with defense contractors, and they're the ones who are letting these contracts to hire our local national partners. But when folks, interpreters in particular, when they work along people like Dave and me, and you're sharing risks every day, you're out in harm's way, we operate on an implicit contract, and that contract is founded on our ethos. And part of that ethos is very much a leave nobody behind. And that's not different for our generation. You mentioned Vietnam. This issue really resonates with Vietnam veterans right now. Vietnam veterans are getting animated about what's going to happen in Afghanistan because they don't want to have to relive what was so traumatic for them when they left behind many of their Vietnamese colleagues when we withdrew from there. And to our credit, we did evacuate 130,000 Vietnamese to Guam in 1975, 75. So if we could do that, then I don't think it's too far-fetched to take care of the Afghans who stood next to us before it's too late.
So we now have a deadline. President Biden has said he wants all U.S. troops withdrawn from Afghanistan by September. What are the concerns about that deadline? I mean, Steve, you mentioned 18,000 applications in the backlog. Those are people who are trying to get this special immigrant visa that, are waiting on an adjudication. Right now, the State Department is not processing hardly any visas anywhere around the world. There's huge backlogs for everything. What are the chances that we get them through by September, and what are the alternatives?
Yeah, at the height of efficiency with processing SIVs, we were doing 4,000 per year. So, I don't think we really even have months, because when you start to do a withdrawal, and I was part of our drawing down in Iraq, the mission becomes leaving. The mission becomes appropriately accounting for your personnel and your equipment, transferring equipment to the Afghans. If you're not transferring it to them, you're shipping it back somewhere in the United States inventory. You're making sure your people are taken care of. You're protecting yourself, but you don't really have the bandwidth to be focused on all of the environmental concerns, of which our Afghan partners would fall into there. So the window of opportunity is really closing in terms of our ability to influence the situation. The Taliban are really putting a stranglehold around seats of government in different provinces, as well as the national capital. And it's getting close to the point where many of these people are not going to have options. And just like Dave was talking about the threats, I mean, they are actively and have been actively targeting our interpreters for the entire conflict. They talk about shoot the eyes, because they know there are cultural eyes, ears, and mouthpieces. There are ability to understand the culture. And if you can blind us culturally, then it really hampers our mission.
And I'd say, Theresa, and to add to Steve's point, again, the risk inside Afghanistan is only becoming greater. The Taliban is becoming more emboldened as the U.S. and its coalition partners depart. And the ability of our forces to intervene, to protect, to do those things, or even to be there to fill out paperwork and to help process this goes away. And that's why you ask about options. And one of them Steve mentioned in the context of Vietnam is Guam. So knowing that the number game just won't work. You cannot process this many visas in that amount of time, given all the demands. So that's why there is a push by some to include members of Congress to use Guam as a safe country or a safe territory. It's a U.S. territory, a safe place for people to go to remove them from the risk while the process takes place. If you just leave them in Afghanistan while we process visa applications, again, the risk is so much higher there. So moving them out to a U.S. territory. Why Guam? One, we've done it before. Two, because as a U.S. territory, we don't have to get permission. The idea of sending these interpreters to other countries out of Afghanistan, that's a fine idea, but it's much more complicated. Now you have to work and negotiate agreements with those countries to take those individuals, allow them to process, through the SIV program from those countries. So Guam remains a viable option, but time is running out because just to physically move them from Afghanistan to Guam will take time.
Yeah, and I want to use that to contrast a little the special immigrant visa process with, say, the refugee process, because you could be describing anyone who, is at risk of persecution from the government for acts they did, right? It's clearly, like these would probably qualify for refugee status as well. But this was a specialized, expedited visa that sort of bypassed some of the long waits that the refugee process did, right? To get the special immigrant visa. But yet they still have to go through all those background checks, all those security checks. Is that one of the reasons why the backlog is still there?
Yeah, I'd say, Theresa, it's, these are the most highly vetted refugees probably anywhere in the world. Every three-letter agency gets a cut at them, and it's a cumbersome process with a lot of redundancies in there that the idea was for it to be streamlined legislatively. Our government has 9 months to do it, but they haven't been able to fulfill that at all for years now. There was a time where we actually got right about at the 9-month mark when we were really at the 4,000 per year level, which was that was how many visas were allocated during those years in the NDAA. But now with this backlog, I mean, it's just the cumbersome bureaucracy is not helping us. And so I completely agree with Dave, with the many veteran service organizations, the nonprofits that are calling for a Guam option. Doesn't need to be Guam, not necessarily, but it needs to be a safe third territory option that removes this population from the risks, because the risks are extreme.
And Theresa, correct me if I'm wrong here, since you know the immigration system so much better than I. Remember, under U.S. law, a refugee is an individual, non-U.S., in a country that's not their own.
So they have to get someplace else first. Exactly.
Right. They have to get somewhere. So they are outside the United States, but they aren't in the country of their nationality. With Iraqis and Afghans, it's different in that sense. And that's a key difference.
Well, this kind of goes back to Steve's book, right? Ironically, they wanted to apply from inside the country where they could do so relatively safely and not sort of alert anybody to what was going on until they and their family left. By trying to leave the country, that kind of identifies them, right? So that's why the regular refugee process of having them escape to someplace else without help was problematic. Am I right, Steve?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It was extremely dangerous for them to attempt to leave. And so the two options too, and because they had to get to Jordan, which not all of them did. I actually helped a family escape to Turkey, and then they applied through the UNHCR through normal channels. But to get to Amman, you had to drive what they called the highway of death. And that was from Baghdad through Anbar province to the Jordanian border. And it was controlled by Al Qaeda in Iraq at the time and a lot of Sunni insurgents. And nobody in their right mind we didn't drive out there many times because it was too risky, especially without helicopter support. And so they had to go then through Baghdad airport. And the airport was heavily infested with Shia militia, Jaish al-Mahdi in particular. And that was very risky because these were people who were the eyes and ears of Muqtada al-Sadr, and they were looking for traitors, collaborators who were working with the occupiers. It was fraught with risk. And you're absolutely right. They were IDPs in the law, internally displaced persons with respect to legal definitions. So we were just, we were putting together an ad hoc system on the fly while in combat. It was pretty crazy.
I ascribe probably Herculean abilities to the U.S. military, but is there time to do the kind of, relocation that you guys are talking about between now and September?
Some folks have done the math and will tell you, much like we do in the military from a planning perspective, of how many aircraft loads it will take if we started tomorrow versus how many aircraft loads it would take if we started a week from tomorrow versus, 3 weeks from tomorrow. And they can give you the numbers. But it also comes down to will first, the government, the United States government saying, yes, we're going to do this. And then as Steve pointed out with the withdrawal, we already have a lot of military assets dedicated to that mission. And so then we would be taking aircraft for transportation of these individuals out of that flow. Not that it can't be done, it just adds complications to that.
Yeah, Theresa, I absolutely agree with what Dave's saying, that the political will is a crucial factor. But I understand the administration's reluctance here. They're trying to deal with children at the border, and they've got populations of kids accumulating in camps, and they're not sure what the end result is going to be for that. And so the challenge for them is, are the Afghan interpreters rising to the priority levels where they're going to devote attention in order to really get out from underneath this problem. And so what I've been working with a consortium of nonprofits and veteran service organizations and others is what we're trying to do is create the civil society support structure that complements government resettlement agencies in order to have sponsors and church groups and nonprofits prepared to receive Afghan families should the administration execute a Guam-like option. And that'll alleviate their concerns over the downstream policy option of being stuck with another, insolvable problem. And so that's what we're trying to do with the time we have available.
Well, Steve, that reminds me of something you and I talked about when we were teeing up this conversation, is that unlike refugees who have a period of government-funded assistance to kind of acclimatize and settle once they're brought to the United States, we grant folks these visas, but like every other immigrant, other than refugees, once they land, they're kind of on their own. But you and your organization have been working to try to make that landing softer, right? Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So there's several organizations out there that really are doing good work in this space and have worked on the assimilation side of the ecosystem. And so you've got Miri's List has been doing a great job in LA with Syrian refugees and Afghans in particular. No One Left Behind has had chapters all over the country where they have helped on that as well. And those organizations are really filling a gap in the government services that, as you point out, are not applicable to the SIV candidates. And these are people who are essentially leaving everything behind in their home countries, and they're coming in with a suitcase and a backpack. And so if you think about, if I had to leave tomorrow and flee to another country and I can only take one suitcase, what do I put in there? That's what they're starting with from Afghanistan before they actually get here. So they need all the support they can get. And And to the American people's credit, they've been stepping up. These nonprofits have been mobilizing goodwill, and there are people who are sponsoring and helping with getting jobs and establishing credit ratings and all the basic fundamentals that we would help, somebody fresh out of high school with. But these are, folks who served alongside us in conflict, and so we feel we owe them.
So let's circle back around to this political will question. Is this something the Biden administration can do? Do they need Congress to act, or is it kind of one of those whoever steps up first can make it happen?
So my colleagues who are much more in your space than I am, Theresa, and operate in the immigration channels, are saying they think it's a question of both. They really feel that additional legislation would be needed. There was legislation passed when we moved 130,000 Vietnamese out of Vietnam. What that would do is help to streamline the process in a way where you wouldn't, because if they went to a different channel like the direct access program, which you need sponsors for, and there are all these cumbersome requirements, that would be just as much of a bottleneck as the SIV. And so I would say both. And the good news is we've got people on the Biden administration that really get the problem. They understand it. And it's just a matter of whether or not we can push this to the priority of the decisions to get some action.
Well, this has been really a great conversation. I think it's really important that we get this information out there. I think it's especially appropriate that we do this on Memorial Day weekend. I want to end, if either of you want to share a story of a particular person that you worked with who you think epitomizes the service that the Afghans and the Iraqis provided to our folks.
I'll defer to Steve because, again, even though I was in Al Anbar province in Iraq in some, tough times, I was pretty close to the headquarters, and same thing in Kabul. So I know Steve was on the ground and much closer to interpreters than I was. So over to you, buddy.
Thanks, Dave. So Theresa, one of the primary characters that I describe and I use the term character in the book. He's a real person, but I needed to use his nom de guerre because his family would still be at risk if people knew his real name, even today. This is, more than 10 years after the fact of escaping. But Ronnie was just an amazing young man out on patrol every day, fearless, helping warn us of everything from potential attacks, but also keeping us from doing stupid things that we just didn't know any better because we didn't understand the culture as well as he did. And to his credit, he decided when he got approved for the special immigrant visa, he didn't want to go to the United States yet. And he came to me, and this was at the height of sectarian cleansing. And he said, "Sir, I don't want to go." And I said, "I think you're crazy." And he said, "Nope. I don't want to have to get to America and have to depend on anybody. So I'm going to stay here and save up enough money so I'm self-sufficient when I get there." And he ended up making it work. It was a long, circuitous process with multiple restarts. He got sent back from Oman twice. But when he did get to the US, he enlisted in the Army. He deployed back to combat as a combat linguist. And then after serving out his time in uniform, he went to work for a defense contractor and did counter ISIS messaging on social media to push back against their ideology. There's no native-born American could do what Ronnie has done for us from a national security perspective. And that's what we're missing out on if we don't reach out to these Afghans who've been standing next to us for the last 20 years.
Well, Dave, I want to thank you for coming back. I want to thank you for introducing us to Steve. Steve, before we leave, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to tell people where can they find out more if they want to help you in your organizations. Give us some plugs.
So, Theresa, they can find out at the Strategically Protecting Soft Networks website, which is protectingsoftnetworks.org. They can read about it at the tail end of my book. I write about all the different nonprofits that are in that space. IRAP, the International Refugee Assistance Project. So my book's available on Amazon now. That's a good way. Or just Google me, reach out, and find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I respond to every message I get, and I'm happy to try to help. I get messages every day from Afghans, from Iraqis, and Americans trying to figure out these difficult problems, and I'm happy to try to help.
Well, thanks to you both. Thanks for being here, and thanks for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
Thank you.
Thanks, TB.
That's it for today's show. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show today at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Rachel Yakino. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tawahara and Ethan Plotkin produce and edit our show. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.